In 1965, she slid a brown paper grocery bag onto the middle rack of a hot gas oven. Inside the bag was an apple pie. It looked like the kind of mistake that could burn the kitchen down, but she closed the oven door anyway because that paper bag was protecting the only dessert her family could afford to make that month. She took a step back from the stove and wiped her hands slowly down the front of her flour-dusted apron. The kitchen settled into a heavy, warm quiet. The round analog clock above the sink read exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She walked to the small wooden table by the window, pulled out a chair, and sat down to wait. She did not leave the room to fold laundry. She did not go into the parlor to listen to the radio. She simply sat, her eyes fixed on the white enamel of the oven door. In 35 minutes, she would open that door. And when she did, the dessert she had spent all morning building would either be saved or completely ruined. There was no middle ground. There was no money in the coffee can on the counter to buy a replacement if she was wrong. As the gas flame hissed softly beneath the floor of the oven, she sat at the table and thought about the morning's labor. The apples inside that paper bag were not pristine, wax-coated orchard fruit. They were the bruised, misshapen culls she had found at the back of the grocer's produce section, sold for 9 cents a pound because no one else wanted them. She had spent an hour at the sink with a small paring knife, meticulously cutting away the brown spots and the soft flesh, saving every usable sliver of fruit, refusing to let an ounce go to waste. The crust wasn't made with sweet creamery butter. It was made with cheap, rendered lard. The Sunday before, she had taken a 5-pound bag of fat trimmings the butcher had set aside for her and slowly melted it down in a cast-iron pot until it was pure white and shelf-stable. She had rolled that lard into the flour on a kitchen counter that had not been replaced since the year she got married. She cut the fat into the dry flour with the back of a fork until it resembled coarse sand, building a crust that required precision to keep from turning tough. She had constructed this pie knowing that one bad bake, one uneven hot spot in that temperamental gas oven would mean her family would have nothing sweet after the Sunday roast. The clock on the wall moved to 2:15. The air in the kitchen began to change. The sharp, sweet scent of cinnamon and nutmeg started to slip out of the oven vents, but it was mixed with the unmistakable smell of toasted paper. She stood up from the wooden table and walked quietly over to the stove. She leaned down and peered through the small, thick glass window of the oven door. The brown craft paper bag was darkening at the edges. The folds she had made at the top were beginning to crisp, the corners turning a deep toasted brown. In 20 more minutes, that bag would look like charcoal. She walked back to the table and sat down. Through the kitchen window, she could see her 2 daughters playing in the patchy grass of the backyard. The clock read 2:25. She had not invented this. She had learned it from her grandmother, who had learned it from her own grandmother. A paper bag trick the women of Lancaster County had passed down for 3 generations. She set her hands flat against the worn wood grain of the tabletop. She did not move them. The clock moved to 2:45. The kitchen was thick now with the smell of hot paper and rendered lard and bubbling cinnamon. The scent had settled into the curtains. She had not moved from the table in 20 minutes. The ambient hiss of the gas flame seemed to grow louder in the quiet room. The bag inside was enduring blistering heat. To anyone walking through the front door at that exact moment, the smell of the scorching paper would have caused immediate panic. It smelled like the second before a fire. It is the visual that confuses the modern eye. Paper inside a roaring oven. So why didn't it burn? The trick was not magic. It was steam. When the pie was placed inside the heavy craft paper bag and folded shut, the bag became a poor man's Dutch oven. As the heat hit the pie, the moisture from the raw apples began to evaporate. But instead of venting out into the oven, That moisture turned into a thick cloud of steam that stayed trapped inside the paper. The steam did two things. It shielded the delicate lard crust from the oven's harshest dry heat, preventing the top from turning into a burnt shell. And it kept the inside of the bag wet enough that the paper itself could brown on the outside without catching fire. The paper darkened. It did not ignite. But it is a piece of chemistry locked in the past. The technique worked because mid-century grocery bags were made of heavy, unbleached craft wood pulp, pure paper. Many modern grocery bags are made with recycled fibers, inks, adhesives, or coatings that were not part of the plain craft paper used in mid-century kitchens. This is history, not a suggestion. The kitchen clock read 3:10. Inside the oven, the bag was a deep scorched brown now, the color of dark cardboard. The edges were warped and stiff. The smell of burned paper in the kitchen was sharp enough to sting the eyes. She stood up from the wooden table. The waiting was over. She walked to the kitchen counter and picked up a thick folded cotton dish towel. She stepped in front of the white enamel door. She took a slow, steadying breath. She gripped the metal handle and pulled the heavy iron door open. A wave of dry, intense heat rolled out into the kitchen and hit her apron. Sitting on the middle rack was the grocery bag. It looked completely ruined, scorched, brittle, darker than roasted coffee beans. But it was intact. There was no flame. There were no ashes. Using the cotton towel, she reached into the heat and gripped the sides of the brittle bag. It crackled under her touch. The paper had lost every ounce of its flexibility. She slid the pie and the bag off the wire rack and carried it to the wooden table. As it rested on the wood, the brown edges of the paper were so dry that tiny flakes began to snap off and fall to the tabletop. She turned back to the counter, opened a drawer, and pulled out her small wooden-handled paring knife. She stepped back to the table. The bag was still radiating heat. She slipped the sharp edge of the blade directly under the metal paper clips she had used to crimp the top shut. With a swift, practiced motion, she sliced the top fold of the scorched paper completely open. A massive, thick plume of white steam escaped from the dark cavern of the bag, billowing up toward the kitchen ceiling. As the steam cleared, the interior of the bag was revealed. Sitting in the center was the pie. The crust was not burnt. It was a flawless golden brown. Through the decorative slits she had cut into the top dough, she could see the dark cinnamon-coated apples bubbling in their own heavy syrup. She reached her towel-wrapped hands into the torn brittle paper and gripped the edges of the glass pie dish. She lifted the heavy dessert out of the ruined bag in a single fluid motion. The crust, made from cheap butcher's trimmings, looked exactly like brown butter. Because the steam had cooked the apples perfectly, the bottom of the crust had not been forced to sit in a pool of unevaporated juice. It was dry enough to hold, crisp at the edge, and still tender underneath. The bruised apples had softened completely. Their tough skins had broken down in the steam, mixing with the rendered fat and sugar to create a rich, dark filling. She carried the glass dish to the counter and set it gently onto a wire cooling rack. The glass clicked quietly against the metal. The dessert was saved. The kitchen clock read 3:35. She untied her apron, draped it over the back of the wooden chair, and walked to the back door. She pushed the screen open and called out into the yard, telling her daughters it was time to come inside and wash up for supper. Behind her, the kitchen smelled of sugar and baked fruit and the lingering sharp scent of scorched wood pulp. On the table sat the dark, brittle, torn remains of a grocery bag that had done its job perfectly. The bag was thrown away. The trick was not. Most of these kitchen tricks were never written down. They were carried from one woman's hands to another's. This channel is documenting what remains. If that matters to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Every video goes deeper.